He was in a meeting when he died. His avatar stayed online. The discussion continued. No one was in the room. This is a story about a murder that happened while everyone was connected. Prologue. The meeting had been running for 17 minutes when the avatar stopped moving. No one noticed immediately. That, later, would become the most uncomfortable detail. The virtual conference room was designed to feel neutral. A circular table, soft lighting, no walls, only an abstract horizon that suggested space without defining it. The avatars were seated evenly, each one identical in posture, differing only in facial presets and name tags hovering politely above their heads. Everyone was present. Everyone was connected. Everyone believed everyone else was there. At 09:17, Michael Grant's avatar froze. His head tilted slightly to the left. One hand remained raised as if he had been about to make a point. His mouth was open mid-sentence. For a few seconds, no one reacted. Lag was common. Someone chuckled quietly. "Looks like Michael's having issues again," a voice said. Another voice followed, casual and practiced. "Yeah, he's frozen on my end too." The meeting continued. At 09:19, the system logged Michael Grant as active. His connection had not dropped. His audio channel remained open. His biometric integration showed no anomalies severe enough to trigger alerts. In the virtual room, Michael Grant was still there. In the physical one, he was already dead. Edward Hale read the transcript twice before asking a question. "How long," he asked, "does it take before absence becomes suspicious?" No one in the room answered him. The executives who had attended the meeting sat quietly now, their confidence drained by hindsight. They had been interviewed individually. Their statements were consistent, almost rehearsed, though none of them had spoken together since that morning. "It didn't feel urgent," one of them had said. "These things happen," another added. "We assumed he'd reconnect." Edward had written those phrases down. Assumption was always faster than concern. Michael Grant had been found at 11:42, a wellness check, routine. His assistant hadn't been able to reach him. The door was locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry, no visible injuries. Michael Grant was still wearing the VR headset. The device was powered on. The meeting had ended normally at 09:52. Edward stood in the apartment doorway, careful not to cross the threshold yet. The space was quiet, too quiet for a room that had supposedly been occupied for hours. Curtains half drawn, kitchen untouched. No movement, no background noise, no sign of interruption. The headset cable trailed neatly across the floor, untouched. Edward looked at the body. Michael Grant was seated upright in his chair, head angled unnaturally, hands resting where they had been when the meeting began. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no evidence that anything unexpected had happened. If Edward had known better, he would have said the man had simply stopped. Edward turned to the officer beside him. "When was the last confirmed movement?" Edward asked. The officer hesitated. "During the meeting, around 9. Edward wrote that down. Presence without awareness. Edward removed the headset carefully and examined it. No damage, no malfunction, no evidence of electrical failure. The device had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had isolated its user. Edward reviewed the meeting footage later that day. The avatars moved smoothly. Voices overlapped politely. Michael's avatar remained still for 35 minutes after it froze, a silent witness to a conversation that assumed his continued participation. Not once did anyone stop the meeting. Not once did anyone say his name with concern. Edward paused the footage at 09:17. Michael Grant's avatar was still there. Edward wrote one sentence under the timestamp and underlined it twice. He did not disappear. He became acceptable to ignore. The official narrative formed quickly. Chapter 1. Everyone was there. Edward Hale began with the attendance list, not the official one generated by the VR platform, but the human one, who believed they had been present when Michael Grant died. There were 9 people in the meeting. 8 of them would later say the same thing in slightly different words. He was there. His avatar had not disappeared. His name had not grayed out. His connection status had remained green. In every socially meaningful sense, Michael Grant had been present. Edward wrote the word present in his notebook and circled it. Presence, he knew, had become negotiable. The meeting transcript read like hundreds Edward had seen before. Polite interruptions, corporate vocabulary, strategic pauses that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Michael Grant had spoken early, clearly, confidently. At 09:16, he had been making a point about timelines. At 09:17, his avatar froze mid-gesture. No one addressed it directly. Edward marked the moment. 09:17:08. Last confirmed verbal contribution. From that point on, Michael Grant existed only as an image. Edward interviewed the participants one by one, always starting with the same question. "When did you realize something was wrong?" he asked. The answers were revealing. "After the meeting," one said. "When he didn't respond to messages," another added. "When security called," a third admitted. Edward nodded each time. "And during the meeting?" he asked. They all hesitated. During the meeting, nothing had required action. Edward noticed a pattern. No one described concern. They described inconvenience. He usually has connection issues. These platforms glitch. He probably stepped away. Each explanation required less emotional investment than interruption. Edward wrote, "Technology absorbs doubt." Edward reviewed the system logs next. The platform had done its job perfectly. Michael Grant's headset was connected. His biometric sensors registered baseline activity, heart rate within acceptable parameters, body temperature stable. No alarms triggered. The system had no reason to flag anything. Edward closed the report. The system had not failed. It had trusted the wrong signals. Edward returned to the apartment later that evening. Without the headset, the room felt smaller, more vulnerable. A single chair facing empty space. No screens active, no voices. The silence was physical, pressing in a way virtual environments never were. Edward stood where Michael Grant had stood before sitting down. The chair was positioned carefully, not casually. Michael had prepared for the meeting, adjusted the angle, checked the connection, placed the headset with routine familiarity. Edward imagined the moment the device went on. The world did not disappear. It was simply deprioritized. Edward examined the locks. The door had not been forced. The windows were closed. The security system showed no breach. Everything about the apartment suggested continuity. Nothing had been interrupted. That was troubling. Edward knew crimes often announced themselves through disruption, broken objects, altered spaces, evidence of resistance. Here, nothing had resisted. Edward returned to the meeting footage. He watched the avatars interact, gestures looped naturally, facial expressions updated automatically. The platform was designed to compensate for absence, smoothing over pauses, maintaining rhythm. Michael Grant's avatar did not break that rhythm. It simply stopped contributing. Edward paused the footage at 09:23. Someone addressed Michael directly. "Michael, do you want to add anything?" No response. A brief pause followed. Then someone else spoke. The meeting moved on. Edward wrote another line. "Silence is acceptable if it looks intentional." Edward questioned the meeting moderator last. "You could have stopped the meeting," Edward said. "Yes," the moderator replied. "But you didn't," Edward said. The moderator sighed. "It didn't seem serious," he said. "People go quiet. Cameras freeze. You don't want to overreact." Edward nodded. "And what would overreaction have looked like?" Edward asked. The moderator thought. "Calling him," he said, interrupting everyone. Edward closed his notebook. Overreaction, Edward knew, was often the only thing that saved lives. Edward pieced it together slowly. Michael Grant had not disappeared from the meeting. He had not been removed. He had not even been questioned. He had simply been allowed to fade into acceptable silence. Edward stood by the window and looked down at the city below. Thousands of apartments, thousands of closed doors, thousands of people connected elsewhere, present in rooms that did not exist. Edward wrote the final line of the chapter with care. When presence becomes symbolic, absence becomes invisible. Chapter 2. What VR Takes Away. Edward Hale did not begin this chapter with technology. He began with the body. Michael Grant had not died violently. That much was already clear. No defensive wounds, no signs of panic, no sudden disruption of posture beyond the final collapse. Whatever had happened, it had occurred within a narrow physiological window where the body failed quietly. Edward stood in the apartment again, this time with the medical examiner present. "Show me how he was sitting," Edward said. The examiner adjusted the chair, aligning it with the marks on the floor, the pressure pattern on the seat cushion, the angle of the headset strap against the headrest. "Like this," the examiner said. Edward nodded. "And when the headset is on?" Edward asked. The examiner placed it carefully. The transformation was immediate. The room ceased to matter. Edward had worn VR headsets before, briefly, long enough to understand the effect. The device did not simply replace vision, it reordered priority. What the eyes saw became dominant. Everything else was demoted to background noise. Edward stood behind the chair. "From here," he said, "how much of the room does he perceive?" The examiner shook his head. "Very little," he said. "Peripheral vision is gone. Spatial cues are altered." "And sound?" Edward asked. "Directional, but filtered," the examiner replied. "Most systems dampen external noise." Edward wrote that down. The headset narrows reality. Edward reconstructed the sensory environment. Vision, fully occupied. Hearing, selectively muted. Balance, partially altered. Touch, interpreted through expectation. The human brain, Edward knew, was not designed for subtraction. When senses were removed, the brain filled gaps with assumption. That worked well in controlled environments. It worked poorly when something unexpected entered the room. Edward reviewed the headset specifications. Noise cancellation adaptive to speech frequency. Environmental sounds deprioritized. The system assumed that anything outside the virtual room was irrelevant. Edward paused on that line. Irrelevant to whom? Edward considered the most basic question. If someone entered the apartment, Edward asked the examiner, would he notice? The examiner hesitated. That depends on the noise, on the movement, on whether the person interacted directly. Edward nodded. And if they didn't? Edward asked. The examiner shrugged. Then maybe not, he said. Edward wrote, presence without signal is ignored. Edward tested it himself. He put on the headset. The apartment vanished. The world reduced to neutral light, floating avatars, simulated space. Edward heard voices, distant but clear, unrelated to the room he was standing in. Someone moved behind him. Edward did not turn. The movement did not belong to the environment his brain had prioritized. Edward removed the headset slowly. This, he said quietly, is the crime scene. Edward examined the apartment again with new eyes. Nothing had been disturbed. That was not evidence of absence. It was evidence of control. An intruder who moved slowly, quietly, deliberately, could exist in this space without announcing themselves. The victim's posture, constrained by the chair and headset, limited reaction time. The physical environment did not invite sudden motion. Edward noted the layout. Narrow entryway, soft flooring. No loose objects. Furniture positioned for minimal obstruction. This apartment had been optimized for calm. Calm, Edward knew, was not safety. Edward asked another question. If someone wanted to incapacitate him, Edward said, what would they need? The examiner considered. Access to the airway, he said, or a sudden physiological shock. And how much force? Edward asked. Not much, the examiner replied, especially if the subject is relaxed, unaware. Edward wrote unaware and underlined it. Edward thought back to the meeting. Michael Grant had been speaking confidently moments before the freeze. No signs of distress, no hesitation. He had been engaged. Then, nothing. Edward knew what that meant. The interruption had been external. Edward returned to the meeting footage. At 09:17:08, Michael's voice cut off mid-sentence, not gradually, not distorted, just gone. No one reacted. Edward watched the moment repeatedly. The silence did not trigger concern because it fit the context. Lag, audio issues, common explanations absorbed it instantly. Edward wrote, "Technology provides plausible deniability for reality." Edward considered the timing again. The headset went on at 09:02. The freeze occurred at 09:17. 15 minutes, long enough for isolation to normalize, short enough for urgency to feel unlikely. Edward nodded slowly. This was not an opportunistic crime. This was a timed one. Edward closed the chapter with a realization that settled heavily. VR had not killed Michael Grant. It had removed his ability to notice danger until it was too late. The killer had not needed to overpower him. They had only needed to wait until the room no longer existed. Edward wrote the final line carefully. The most dangerous technology is the one that convinces you nothing else matters. Chapter 3. The Quiet Apartment. Edward Hale trusted silence more than testimony. Silence, unlike people, rarely tried to convince him of anything. The apartment where Michael Grant died was not large, but it was deliberate. Every object had been placed with intention. Minimal furniture, soft materials, muted colors. The kind of space designed to disappear once you stopped paying attention to it. Which, Edward noted, was exactly what had happened. Edward walked the apartment slowly, retracing the path a person would take after entering. The door opened inward without resistance. The hinges were well oiled, no squeak. The floor absorbed sound. Even hurried footsteps would have registered as dull pressure rather than noise. Edward paused. This was not accidental. Luxury apartments were often built this way. Silence was marketed as comfort. Insulation was sold as privacy. In practice, it meant that intrusion could occur without announcement. Edward wrote in his notebook, "Quiet is not absence. Quiet is concealment." Edward examined the entryway. No shoes displaced, no signs of a hurried entrance or exit. The security system logs showed nothing abnormal. The door had not been forced. The lock had not been tampered with. That suggested two possibilities. Either no one else had entered, or someone had entered with permission. Edward preferred the second. Edward moved toward the living area. The chair was positioned precisely in front of an empty section of wall. Not a television, not a window, nothing that might distract from the virtual environment. Michael Grant had curated his space to support immersion. Edward imagined him sitting down, adjusting the chair, checking the connection, putting on the headset. Edward knew what that moment meant. From that point on, the room became irrelevant. Edward crouched beside the chair. There were no marks on the floor, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture. The body had not been dragged or repositioned. Michael Grant died where he sat. Edward stood. That fact ruled out panic. Panic left chaos. This scene had none. Edward examined the kitchen next. Untouched. No open drawers. No disturbed items. Whoever had been in this apartment had not searched it. They had not lingered. They had not needed anything from the space. Edward returned to the living area. This was not a burglary. Edward focused on sound. He closed his eyes and imagined the environment as it would have been at 0917. The city outside, distant traffic, HVAC hum, the soft electronic whisper of the headset. Anything subtle would have been absorbed. Edward snapped his fingers softly. The sound barely carried. Edward wrote, "Noise without meaning is ignored." Edward asked the building manager a question later that day. "Has anyone complained about noise from this apartment?" Edward asked. The manager shook his head. "No," he said. "Mr. Grant was very quiet." Edward nodded. Quiet again. Edward examined the ventilation system. Airflow was constant but gentle. The vents were positioned to minimize sound. The system was designed to maintain comfort, not alertness. Edward considered something. If someone spoke softly behind Michael Grant while the headset was on, would he hear it? The answer, Edward knew, was no. Edward returned to the door. The lock mechanism was modern but not complex. Keycard access paired with a manual deadbolt. The logs showed only one unlock event that morning, Michael Grant's. Edward stared at the door longer than necessary. Doors lied in one of two ways: by pretending they had never been opened, or by pretending they had only been opened once. Edward wrote, "Access does not require entry." Edward reviewed the building's common areas. Hallway cameras showed nothing unusual. No one loitered, no one rushed. No one carried anything suspicious. Edward did not expect them to. If someone belonged in the building, their presence would not register as threat. Edward returned to the apartment again. He stood behind the chair. This was where it would have happened. The killer would not have approached quickly. Speed created noise. Speed created urgency. The killer would have moved slowly, carefully, almost respectfully. Edward imagined a hand reaching out. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough. Edward spoke to the medical examiner again. "If someone applied pressure from behind," Edward said, "while the subject was seated and unaware, what would you expect?" The examiner considered. "Loss of consciousness could occur quickly," he said, "especially if the subject's posture was fixed." "And reaction?" Edward asked. "Minimal. Confusion before awareness." Edward nodded. No scream. No struggle. No warning. Edward returned to the meeting footage one more time. The moment Michael Grant's avatar froze aligned precisely with the estimated time of collapse. Edward circled the timestamp, 0917:08. Edward wrote beneath it, "The quietest moment is when the room disappears." Edward closed the chapter with a realization that had been forming since the first walkthrough. This apartment had not protected Michael Grant. It had prepared him to be alone without realizing it. Edward wrote the final line slowly. "Silence is not what hides a crime. Silence is what makes it possible." Chapter 4. The moment the headset goes on. Edward Hale believed that most crimes were decided long before they were committed. The act itself was often brief, unremarkable, sometimes almost disappointing. What mattered was the moment when the victim unknowingly agreed to the conditions of their own vulnerability. In this case, that moment had a precise timestamp, 09:02. That was when Michael Grant put on the headset. Edward reconstructed the minutes before the meeting with the same care he would apply to a crime scene. Michael Grant arrived home at 0841. The building cameras showed him entering alone, carrying nothing unusual. He took the elevator to his floor. No one followed closely enough to register as suspicious. Nothing broke routine. At 0847, he unlocked his apartment. At 0848, the door closed. After that, the apartment disappeared from the building's attention. Edward noted how long Michael remained visible to the world. Less than 7 minutes. Enough time to become unreachable. Edward reviewed Michael Grant's habits. He was punctual, methodical. He prepared for meetings early. Notes were reviewed in advance. Equipment was tested. Michael did not rush. He trusted systems because systems had always worked for him. Edward stood in the apartment again and imagined the preparation. Curtains adjusted, chair aligned, headset charged. This was not carelessness, this was confidence. Edward focused on one detail the reports had initially dismissed. Michael Grant had checked the door twice. Once when he entered, once just before the meeting. Edward replayed the hallway footage. At 08:59, Michael opened the door slightly, looked down the corridor, then closed it again. The motion was brief, almost unconscious. Edward wrote, "Anticipation without suspicion." Michael Grant had sensed something, not danger, but interruption, a minor uncertainty. The kind people resolved by confirming normality rather than questioning it. The door was locked. The world felt ordered again. Edward examined the meeting schedule. Michael Grant was the first speaker. That mattered. Being the first speaker meant he would not be free to remove the headset casually. He would not stand up. He would not check his surroundings once the meeting began. His attention would be anchored immediately. Edward wrote, "Commitment precedes isolation." Edward reviewed the biometric data again. At 09:01:52, baseline readings were stable. At 09:02:00, headset engagement logged. At 09:02:03, environmental noise suppression activated. Edward underlined the last line. From that second onward, the apartment ceased to produce meaningful information. Edward asked the examiner a question. "If someone entered the apartment at 09:02, Edward said, "how long would it take before the subject noticed?" The examiner shook his head slowly. "If the headset was properly seated," he said, "he might not notice at all." Edward nodded. "And if someone spoke?" Edward asked. "Unlikely, unless they raised their voice." Edward closed his notebook. Raising a voice would have been unnecessary. Edward examined the headset straps. They were adjusted snugly, not tight, comfortable, designed to be forgotten once worn. The weight distribution encouraged stillness. Head movement was limited. Posture stabilized. Edward knew what that meant. The device did not restrain, it persuaded. Edward returned to the timeline. 09:02, headset on. 09:03, virtual room loads. 09:04, avatars appear. 09:05, meeting begins. Edward circled the first minute. If someone had been inside the apartment already, this was when they would move. If someone intended to enter, this was when the risk dropped to nearly zero. Edward wrote, "The safest moment is when the victim believes they are no longer alone." Edward considered access again. The logs showed no door opening after 08:48. Edward did not accept that. Access, he knew, did not always leave a digital trace, especially when permission had been granted earlier, especially when trust had already been established. Edward began compiling a list. People with keys, people with codes, people whose presence would not alarm Michael Grant. The list was not long. That was encouraging. Edward returned to the chair one last time. He stood behind it and imagined the killer's perspective. No rush, no fear, no need for force. just patience. The killer would wait for the headset to go on, wait for the world to shrink, wait for the room to fall silent, then step forward. Edward wrote the final line of the chapter slowly, deliberately. The crime did not begin when the killer touched him. It began when Michael Grant decided the room no longer mattered. Chapter 5. The person who was already inside. Edward Hale stopped thinking about doors. Doors were a distraction. They invited questions about locks, logs, forced entry, and clever ways around them. This case did not need cleverness. It needed familiarity. The person who killed Michael Grant had not entered the apartment. They had never left it. Edward returned to the building records with a different assumption. Not who could get in, but who would not be questioned for being there. He reviewed access privileges first. Former employees, contractors, building staff, cleaning services, all accounted for, all logged, all routine. Then Edward looked at the personal list. Friends, partners, people Michael trusted enough to give space. That list was shorter. Edward noticed one name he had seen before, quietly recurring across different contexts. Daniel Reeves. Daniel Reeves was not a stranger. He was Michael Grant's former business partner. They had founded the company together years ago. Daniel had left after a disagreement that had been described officially as amicable. Unofficially, it had been anything but. Edward reviewed their history carefully. Emails, meeting notes, legal filings. The language was polite, professional, carefully neutral. But beneath it ran a consistent pattern: unresolved control. Daniel had not lost access immediately after leaving the company. His key card was revoked months later. His physical key never returned. Edward circled that detail. Physical keys did not expire. Edward interviewed Daniel Reeves the next morning. Daniel arrived cooperative, composed, appropriately concerned. "I heard what happened. Terrible thing." Edward nodded. "When did you last see Michael?" Edward asked. Daniel thought. "A few weeks ago," he said. "We met for coffee." Edward nodded. "And the apartment?" Edward asked. "Had you been there recently?" Daniel hesitated just long enough to notice. "No," he said. "Not in months." Edward did not challenge that yet. Edward laid out the timeline calmly. "Michael arrived home at 0841, Edward said. "He locked the door at 0848. He put on the headset at 0902. Edward paused. "After that," Edward continued, "nothing in the apartment registered presence." Daniel nodded. "That's what you said," he replied. Edward leaned forward. "Where were you between 0845 and 0920? Edward asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "At home, on my own call." Edward nodded. "Online?" Edward asked. "Yes," Daniel said, "just like everyone else." Edward wrote "online" and underlined it. Edward explained the mistake slowly. "You assumed," Edward said, "that the only way to be in the apartment was to enter it." Daniel's expression remained neutral. "But if someone had been there earlier," Edward continued, "they wouldn't need to enter at all." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. Edward answered evenly. "The guest room," he said. Daniel's jaw tightened. Edward had already examined it. The guest room was minimal, clean, rarely used, no signs of disturbance, no personal items left behind, nothing that would suggest recent occupancy. That was precisely why it mattered. A room designed to be unused was the safest place to be unseen. Edward continued. "You arrived earlier that morning," Edward said, "before Michael came home." Daniel shook his head. "There's no record of that," he said. Edward nodded. "There wouldn't be," he replied. "The building cameras don't record residents' guests exiting apartments, only entering common areas." Daniel's silence lengthened. Edward described the rest without raising his voice. You waited, quietly, not hiding, just being where no one expected to look. Edward paused. You heard Michael come in, he said. You heard him prepare. You heard the headset power on. Daniel swallowed. And when the world disappeared for him, Edward continued, you stepped out. Edward addressed the mechanics calmly. You approached from behind, slowly. You knew the headset blocked peripheral vision. You knew the noise cancellation would absorb your movement. Daniel stared at the table. You didn't need force, Edward said. Just timing. Edward paused. A brief interruption, he said. Enough to cause collapse. Enough to look natural. Daniel finally spoke. I didn't mean to kill him, he said. Edward nodded. No one ever does, he replied. Daniel continued, his voice lower now. He was going to cut me out completely. The company, the credit, everything. Edward nodded again. And you decided that the safest moment to confront him was when he was least able to confront you back. Daniel looked up. Everyone was there, in the meeting. Edward met his eyes. That's why you chose it, Edward said. Edward closed the file. You didn't rely on technology. You relied on trust. Daniel did not respond. As security arrived, Edward stood. The building would be sealed, reports would be written, systems would be reviewed, new alerts would be discussed. None of that would change the core fact. Michael Grant had not been killed because he was online. He had been killed because he believed the room he was in no longer mattered. Edward wrote the final line of the chapter carefully. The most dangerous place is not where no one is watching. It is where everyone believes they are. Epilogue. Alone together. Edward Hale left the apartment after sunset. The building was still alive. Lights burned behind glass. Screens flickered. Voices drifted through walls, distorted by distance and insulation. From the outside, the place looked full, occupied, connected. Edward knew better. He paused in the hallway and listened. No footsteps. No conversation. Just the low, constant hum of systems designed to make silence comfortable. Daniel Reeves would confess. Not immediately, not dramatically. The confession would come after lawyers, after exhaustion, after the realization that there was no version of the story in which he was already alone. Edward did not stay for it. Confessions rarely added information. They only added justification. The report would read clean. Cause of death. Timeline. Means of access. The word virtual would appear several times, usually in contexts that suggested novelty or danger. There would be discussions, panels, opinion pieces. Edward knew how that cycle ended. People would talk about devices, about safety protocols, about better alerts. They would not talk about presence. Edward stepped outside into the street. People walked past him while speaking to voices that were not there, faces lit by screens, hands gesturing to invisible audiences, bodies moving through space without fully inhabiting it. Everyone was somewhere else. Edward thought of Michael Grant, not of the moment he died, but of the moment just before it, when he believed completely and reasonably that he was not alone. That belief had been fatal. Edward opened his notebook one last time. He did not write about VR. He did not write about locks or keys. He wrote a single sentence and closed the book. Connection is not proximity. The apartment would be cleaned. The headset would be cataloged. The chair repositioned. The room reset. Soon someone else would sit there. They would put on the device. They would disappear politely. They would trust the silence. Edward Hale walked on. Somewhere, another meeting was starting. Another avatar was loading. Another room was being abandoned without being left. Edward would not be there for most of them. But sometimes, when absence went unnoticed for too long, someone would remember that being present somewhere else did not mean you were safe where you were. And sometimes that would be enough. He didn't disappear from the meeting. He disappeared from the room. If you want more detective stories like this, stories where crimes don't look like crimes, subscribe to the channel. The next case will happen while everyone believes they are present. They won't be